welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director designate of the Orchestre Nationale de Lille and the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive in to this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Charles, Alex, and Tomas, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/stickynotespodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. I am in Brussels this week with the National Orchestra of Belgium, doing a really nice program with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, Peter Swart's Cello Concerto, a world premiere cello concerto, and Ligidi's Romanian Concerto. And I counted, I think I've conducted the Ligidi about 25 times in my life, so it's always great to come back to that piece and do it again. It's such a surprise for the audience to hear Ligidi sounding that way. It's a piece I'll definitely try to talk about at a future date on the show. For now, I'm really excited to share with you part 2 of Schubert's Sonata in B flat. There are a few tropes when it comes to Schubert's late, as in music he wrote at the end of his life, music. The pieces are very long, sometimes up to an hour, depending on repeats and tempo. They have 4 movements, and the first 2 movements are expansive, magisterial explorations of the human psyche, and the last 2 movements are much lighter, almost like 2 different pieces are at play. All of these tropes fit the Schubert B Flat Sonata we started talking about a couple of weeks ago. After the huge first movement, Schubert takes us into a world of the most remarkably simple and yet profoundly moving music in the second movement, followed by a scherzo and last movement that seem, and I emphasize the word seem, to wash all of that away. The last 2 movements of this sonata in particular have come in for criticism in some quarters, but this is another common trope for Schubert's music: criticism of the lighter character of his final 2 movements. You hear this criticism about his G Major Quartet, his cello quintet, and other large-scale works. It's also been theorized the final 2-movement so-called curse Schubert seemed to struggle with is why he left his 8th Symphony unfinished. But as you'll hear today, I don't think there's much, if anything, to criticize in these final 2 movements, and I'll try to argue that there's no drop-off in quality in this music, just a different approach and outlook. But the bulk of today's show will be about the second movement of this sonata. No one writes bleak music like Schubert. We hear this in some of his greatest songs, like Der Leiermann from Die Winterreise.
Drüben hinterm Dorfe steht ein Leiermann.
We hear it in his G Major Quartet in his slow movement. We hear it in the final song of Die schöne Müllerin, Der Müller und der Bach.
Wo ein treues Herz in Liebe vergeht, da welken die Lilien auf jedem Beet.
There is something beyond otherworldly in this character of Schubert's music. It doesn't belong to our world, but it doesn't belong to another world either. Instead, it goes somewhere even deeper than we can possibly imagine. Schubert goes to a different place than any other composer when he is in this so-called mood. And in this movement that we're going to talk about today, that bleak character is married to profound consolation, creating a movement of utter perfection. So let's explore the final three movements of this remarkable sonata together, coming right up on Sticky Notes. What are the characteristics of what I call the bleak Schubert mode? Let's use that song Der Leiermann from the Winterreise as a shining example. The simplicity of the underlying harmony might be the first thing to mention. Throughout almost this entire song, Schubert's harmony is an open fifth on an A and an E, repeating over and over again. There is also an insistent rhythm that repeats again and again, usually some variation of a short-long motif or a long-short motif. In the case of Der Leiermann, the hurdy-gurdy player, the rhythm is long-short. The melodic line is also exceedingly simple. The voice outlines what is essentially an A minor arpeggio with a few leading notes.
Drüben hinterm Dorfe steht ein Leiermann.
One aspect that doesn't appear in Der Leiermann, but that appears in a lot of other bleak Schubert, is a dotted rhythm. Bum, 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 bum. Here's an example of it in Der Müller und der Bach, The Miller and the Brook.
Oh, ein treues Herze in Liebe vergeht, da welken die Lilien auf jedem Beet.
The combination of dotted rhythms, short-long or long-short motivic ideas, melodic lines that hover around the main note of the harmony, and a harmony itself that is extremely spare, is not bleak in and of itself. What really holds all of this together is Schubert's remarkable courage to keep repeating all of this. Every composer has bleak moments in their music, but they usually move on from them relatively quickly. The magic of Schubert is that he is willing to stay in this world for an uncomfortable amount of time. The two songs I've been playing for you stay in this mood for minutes at a time. In the hands of a lesser composer, though, this would get boring or worse, melodramatic. But Schubert's radical simplicity actually serves to make this music completely arresting. You are drawn in slowly, patiently, inexorably to this world of tremendous sadness. And yet, because the underlying harmony is so simple, it doesn't become overwhelming. With a composer like Shostakovich, sometimes his intent is to make you want to escape his music. The feelings of sadness and agony are so overwhelming that you want to scream, and this is, I believe, Shostakovich's intention. But Schubert doesn't do that. You don't want to escape this music. Instead, you are gently and lovingly enveloped by it. All of what I've been talking about here is true of the second movement of Schubert's B Flat Sonata. Let's go into it now, and first I'll just mention the tropes as they come. We have a relentless rhythmic accompaniment which almost never ceases. It's just 4 notes, a C sharp across 4 octaves, that plays a slightly awkward rhythm of long, short, long, long. For the entire first section of this movement, nearly 4 minutes of music depending on your tempo, this rhythm will not leave us. There have been many poetic descriptions of this rhythm, from oars rowing through water, to a person limping, to a more metaphysical image of the wheel of time creaking along. But however you choose to think about it, it is a gently relentless presence in this movement. More tropes. The key is in C sharp minor, and for the first 8 measures of the movement, which take quite a while in this tempo, we don't leave C sharp minor at all. Another quietly radical choice. Classical music is often about the movement of harmony, and so when the harmony stays put, that means something. Schubert keeps us here in C sharp minor with a quiet insistence. The melodic line itself is often punctuated with a dotted rhythm, implying a kind of weight in the music. Here are the first 8 bars of the movement. Listen for the insistent C sharp minor, the rhythmic accompaniment, and the dotted rhythm in this melody. But above all, try to allow yourself to be pulled into this bleak world, even in just this short excerpt. I don't think it will be very difficult. Schubert ends these 8 bars with his melody landing on a root position C sharp minor chord. The terminology is not important, but the choice is. A root position chord simply means the chord is played as it is built, from bottom to top, in this case, C sharp, E, G sharp. It's actually strangely uncommon for chords to be played like this in classical and early Romantic music. Most often a chord would be played in what is called inversion, either first inversion, where the chord would be spelled E, G sharp, C sharp, which creates a kind of fuller sound. Or it could be in second inversion, where the 5th of the chord, G sharp, is on the bottom and the 3rd is on the top. This is even more satisfying. But that's the key, right? Satisfying. Schubert isn't looking for a full sound in this bleak mood. And that small choice of having this phrase end on that root position C sharp minor chord makes clear the spare nature of this music. Now we move on, and Schubert switches the underlying harmony to G sharp, the resolving harmony to C sharp minor. Again, the terminology isn't important. What is important is that now Schubert will carry us along on that G sharp. All along, while we're listening to that, we are desperately, if unconsciously, wishing to return back to the C sharp. It's what Leonard Bernstein described as, quote, the dominant, that resolving chord, seeking its tonic, in this case C sharp, and each tonic turning into a dominant, seeking its tonic over and over again. That's really the point of tonal music, and here Schubert is playing with that. But wasn't that just extraordinary? Even in this slow tempo, we didn't realize how inexorable that rhythm was getting. When I listen to this movement, I don't even realize how much it is ingrained until I realize that I've been slowly rocking back and forth with the rhythm. And suddenly, that rocking is interrupted by that long chord that for one bar doesn't have the rhythm underneath it. We are expecting here to have found our tonic, the C sharp, but instead Schubert turns away. We stay on the G sharp underneath, but instead of going to C sharp minor, we go to E major, the major key friend of C sharp minor. And suddenly we are elevated. Listen to the passage again, from where the G sharp begins. And now that we have found our friendly E major, Schubert moves the harmony bar by bar for the very first time, and we land in E major on that second inversion chord. Almost 2 minutes into this movement, and we have found that sense of sublime consolation that is unique to Schubert. Now, in a feat that is hard to believe, Schubert essentially plays the same music that he played at the beginning of the movement, but now over a relentless E major harmony. What was bleak is now full of love and warmth. No one, and I really mean no one, displays the power of key relationships and harmony like Schubert does. Schubert writes music like Shakespeare does plays, full of subtext that you can choose to explore or to ignore. At the climax of this E major version of the melody, we arrive at that long note from earlier on where Schubert left out the relentless rhythm. But listen to what happens this time. The rhythm sticks with us, inexorable, and instead of consolation, we turn back to C sharp minor, hopeless again. The absence of the rhythm took us to consolation, but its presence takes us back to hopelessness. The first section of this movement is now coming to an end. The movement is in an extremely easy to follow A-B-A form, and to get to his B section, Schubert will leave the relentless rhythm for the very first time, though he now puts a dotted rhythm in the melody on each bar as we explore deeper and deeper realms of harmony. Schubert was one of the first composers to regularly explore the softest of volumes. He regularly writes triple pianissimo, one level softer than the traditional as soft as possible marking. There is a muffled quality to this music, helped along, I think, in this very old recording by Arthur Schnabel. But even in modern performance, the softness here that can be achieved strains the listener and brings us completely inside the music. It's important to mention, though, that Schubert probably never imagined the modern concert experience, where thousands of people, hopefully, sit in a very large concert hall watching a sometimes distant pianist play alone on stage. Schubert normally performed in relatively small rooms in front of relatively small audiences, most of whom wouldn't necessarily be staying quiet throughout the performance. I like to imagine Schubert being transported to a modern concert. Were these moments of extreme quiet meant to settle down rowdy audiences of his time? And would he like the sacred atmosphere his music creates in the concert hall? What happens here is, if you're a first-time listener to this piece, a revelation. So I won't explain it first. To me, this is like being welcomed, even hugged. There is such a warm embrace here that it is overwhelming in all of the best ways. Schubert's harmonies are full of those warm first inversion chords, and while the rhythm is as relentless as before, it is now a gently rolling and flowing set of 16th notes. We have dotted rhythms in the melody, but instead of heaviness, they now float along. Everything about this passage is bathed in a warm glow, exactly the tonic we need after such bleak music before. Every rhythm that weighed us down before has been transformed now. In the second version of this chorale, Schubert starts to expand the range of the piano, which has been limited so far to its muted middle register. He adds more complexity to the rhythmic accompaniment as well, as everything begins to blossom. We almost literally feel the sound world opening up before our eyes and ears. Of course, what would a Schubert slow movement be without some magical modulations? Check this one out, where Schubert goes from D major to B flat major, a friendly wave to his first movement. The consolation here is profound, but we can't stop to enjoy it for too long, as that 16th note accompaniment gently but insistently prods us forward. And now we start to hear some cracks. We return back to the A major from before, but the harmony on the climactic note of the phrase is different from the first time. Listen to the first time. And now how it comes back. Schubert writes an F natural instead of an F sharp on that chord, and it's a reminder that we perhaps haven't fully escaped what came before. And as Schubert ostensibly repeats his chorale, we keep hearing these slightly different, slightly more minor-ish, slightly more dissonant harmonies. It's like the chorale is becoming slightly distorted, as if we can't see it as clearly as we did before. And like those dissonances poisoned us, suddenly the motion becomes aimless. The accompaniment continues, but the melody seems to lose its nerve, and it trails off practically in mid-sentence. This whole chorale has tried to give us a kind of new strength, but in the most heartbreaking moment of the movement, it fails. The music just gives up, and we hear the most terrifying thing of all: silence. With a kind of remorseless inevitability, the opening theme returns, but it has a new and disturbing angle. At the end of each bar, Schubert adds 3 16th notes in the lowest register of the instrument. It's a callback to that unsettling trill that we talked about in the first movement. But now, since it is not disrupting something serene, but in fact adding inescapable momentum to the gloominess of this music, it is even more disturbing. Almost like it is the logical conclusion of that trill. Other than those 16th notes, this music is much the same as in the A section. But as the movement starts to approach its close, Schubert will begin a series of moments, each more extraordinary than the last. First, at this moment in the exposition where we turned towards E major, Schubert stuns us with a move to C major. Why is this so stunning? Well, again, it has to do with key relationships and what, quote, makes sense in the rules of harmony. C sharp minor to E major makes sense because E major is the relative major of C sharp minor. They both have 4 sharps in their key signature. But C major is a galaxy away from C sharp minor on the circle of fifths. And so the shift over is like another galaxy has come to visit this sonata. Imagine where we are on this gloomy and relentless path, perhaps towards death itself. But at this moment, a ray of sunshine, not the full sun, but just a ray, hits us, and we are offered a moment of hope. I don't want to sound overly sentimental, but it's as if this music is momentarily touched by an angel. Then, like nothing happened, Schubert moves over to E major and then back to C sharp minor. It seems again that we have not escaped the gloom. But now we come to his next magical and profoundly moving trick. Schubert now changes the key to C sharp major, a key that has 7 sharps in it, and which is almost never used in classical music. It has a kind of luminous brightness to it, since it is so rare. But Schubert turns the concept of that brightness on its head, and writes for the piano to play again triple pianissimo, robbing C sharp major of its brightness. Instead, what it offers is our most profound consolation yet. The great pianist Paul Lewis describes this moment as, quote, "In Schubert there's this sense of acceptance, I feel. Whereas Beethoven always seems to find an answer, Schubert almost never does. It's so apparent here in such a heartbreaking way. As you come into this last page, there's a sense of reaching out for something that you can't quite reach, that you can't quite get. When you get to the top, you haven't got it. But there's a breathing out, and accepting that that's how it is." Then to go from C sharp minor into this unbelievable C sharp major moment in triple pianissimo. When Schubert uses the major like that, it's anything but a resolution. It's not a reassurance either. It's not that everything is going to be all right. Nothing is going to be all right. It's just about accepting the way things are. As the movement fades away, Schubert hangs on to those 3/16 notes almost until the final bar, in order to transform even those relentless notes into something comforting. The acceptance is complete, and the magisterial first 2 movements of this sonata have come to a close. I think they certainly could be thought of as 2 of the greatest movements that any composer ever wrote. And now, as if in awe of his achievement, Schubert takes us to another world in his scherzo. The first 2 movements of the sonata last around 25 minutes on this recording that I've been using of the great Arthur Schnabel. He doesn't take the first movement repeat, so with that repeat, the first 2 movements take around a half hour to perform. The final 2 movements are about 11 minutes combined. There have been, again, some criticisms of Schubert for this. The last 2 movements certainly take on a completely different character from the first 2 movements, and some have found them overly frivolous, considering the depths of expression of the first 2 movements. Paul Lewis, who I quoted above, disagrees, saying this, quote, "It's almost like 2 different sonatas, but it's not. I'm not religious, but the point you reach here, there's a sense of going over to the other side. You've got to the end of this particular road, and then something else opens up." I agree with Lewis here, and I think the brevity and radical character shift of the last 2 movements can be nothing else than intentional. But this is a common trope with Schubert's late music, as I said. In his G Major Quartet, the first two movements are unbelievably profound explorations of emotion, and the last two are much, much lighter. It's the same in some ways in his Death and the Maiden string quartet. Even though the character of the movements is dark, their fast speed and scintillating excitement are completely different in feeling than the first two movements. Now, in this way, Schubert was still somewhat of a classicist, putting the main depth of expression into the first two movements, and then sending the audience away with something lighter in the final two movements. But there is still some darkness and complexity here. Listen to the little turns of harmony that make this slight scherzo not so simple. All of the harmonic changes in this movement sound to me elegant and also sad, like they are the memories of a lost childhood. Would I think that without the presence of the first two movements? I don't think so, but that to me is the connecting thread between such disparate music. Schubert keeps changing the key to keys with more and more flats, from A flat major to D flat major, darkening the sound further despite the cheerfulness of the music. But I don't want to say this is all about darkness, not at all. At one point we hear a kind of waltz break out in that D flat major key. It is full of that quintessential Viennese elegance. But there, just where I stopped. That, to me, is the thorn in this little movement. The first time this came, Schubert had that chord as a G flat major chord, which makes perfect sense in D flat major. But this time he takes the same note, G flat, though he spells it as F sharp this time, and writes an F sharp minor chord. It's just one note in the chord, but the feeling is completely different, and it takes Schubert to another place entirely. And many things at once come together here that are callbacks to the first two movements. We have a theme in A major, a reminder of the chorale in the slow movement. We also have strange stops and starts in the theme, like in the end of the exposition of the first movement. We also have a relentlessly repeating rhythm, second movement, and a kind of harmonic stasis, first movement development. All of this is packed into less than 30 seconds of music. Still think this movement isn't related to the other two? The middle trio section is yet another curveball from Schubert. The rhythm is extremely off balance, full of syncopations, and oddly placed accents. It's also in B flat minor, the darkest key we've heard yet in the entire piece, all in this short little trio section. Here's the entire thing. And with barely a care in the world, Schubert returns to his outer scherzo section. The whole movement lasts only about 4 minutes, the length of the exposition of the first movement. Schubert almost makes a joke of the coda section of the scherzo. Often a scherzo coda will give a little bit of extra energy and drive before rushing off to the end. In Schubert's case, here is the entire coda of this movement, and don't blink. The last movement has a bit in common with the last movement of the cello quintet, since both have a sort of vaguely, quote, Hungarian character to them. Here's the cello quintet. And now the last movement of the sonata. It again lacks the, quote, seriousness of the first two movements, though it is a little more grounded than the third. Again, though, it feels as if Schubert is letting us off in a different way than composers who came after him would. Remember that the weight shifting towards the last movement of pieces was still a relatively new phenomenon in Schubert's time and was spearheaded by Beethoven. Schubert's audience would not have found this movement strange, and so I think we shouldn't either. This movement is full of humor, like in this moment when the music becomes irresistibly charming before a kind of mocking anger breaks out, the music stops, and the folksy theme begins again. And then Schubert chooses not to develop the folksy theme, but instead this conflict between the charming and the tantrum, with the charming theme clearly winning out despite the best efforts of the rambunctious and not so serious anger. But even in this movement, there are hints of connections with the first two. After this folksy theme passes us by, Schubert brings us a second theme that is just so wonderfully elegant and charming. But here's an esoteric and brilliant connection that I found, of all places, on this sonata's Wikipedia page. So to the anonymous writer of this passage, thank you. If you listen to the amazing C major passage of the second movement and this theme, you'll see that the contour of the melody is exactly the same. This is an amazing callback, though I have no idea if it was wholly intentional. The result is a theme that feels charming, elegant, and also familiar, even if we don't quite know how. There are also callbacks to that heartbreaking fade out in the second movement. Here, though, we don't return to despair, but to the second theme again. All the conflicts and terrors of the first two movements are slowly being resolved here, and Schubert isn't having to fight for it. Instead, he's charming his way through them. But now we have another callback, a sudden stop and silence. We had those in the first and second movements both, so which way are we going to go now? Well, in the case of the last movement, we go to another bit of mocking, almost childlike anger. We jump into F minor and a dotted rhythm punches its way out, reminding us of the dotted rhythms of the second movement. But now there's no way to take this so seriously. It's a kind of temper tantrum that you laugh at or with, rather than shy away from. And Schubert proves that right by gently resolving things, as you heard, into a playful F major. Schubert is resolving conflicts as we go here, never, by the way, letting up on his 16th note accompaniment, yet another callback to the obsessive rhythmic accompaniments from earlier on. This last movement is like a clip show of the first three. And now we're into the development of the movement, which shows off some more of that slightly not to be taken seriously anger from before. Everything is based off of the main theme. And without much struggle, we hear that long G again, and we return to the recapitulation. Everything is compressed in this movement as well, with everything passing by in a flash. As we head to the coda, we again might be expecting something massive to finish off a 40-minute sonata. He certainly seems to be preparing for something as the music starts to fade away, just as it has so many times in this piece. Are we giving up again, or are we preparing for a final charge? Well, it's definitely a final charge, but it's incredibly brief, lasting about 25 seconds, and while it's triumphant, it seems more like a kind of headlong rush rather than anything majestic. This leads to the question, why did Schubert write these last two movements like this? Andras Schiff says this about them, quote, "These last two movements are like a hallucination of a new life. They are what the dying person might experience on the threshold. The coda has a wonderful chaotic joy in it, this rushing out, this looking for the final exit, this last flourish. Schubert is saying yes to life. There is still hope." I definitely can see what Schiff is talking about, but I have a slightly different idea, though I want to emphasize that this is my own personal feeling, and perhaps it's quite a bit based off of being a new parent to a 6-month-old who is sitting beside me as I type this. Schubert knew he was a dying man when he wrote this sonata. He probably didn't know that it would be just a few weeks after he finished this sonata. But he knew that a diagnosis of syphilis in his time meant almost certain death. In my little theory of this piece, the first two movements are the adult Schubert, and the final two are the child inside, or perhaps the memory of childhood. They are movements that are so playful and charming, and they resolve the intense conflicts of the first two movements with innocence and naivete, rather than with force and fury. I have no idea if my theory is correct, but whatever Schubert intended, these 40 to 50 minutes of music are some of the most fulfilling, satisfying, and powerful that I know of. If you were not familiar with this sonata before this show, then I hope I've instilled in you a lifelong love of late Schubert. And if you spent your life with this music, I hope that I've been able to do it some justice. There will be plenty more piano sonatas coming, as this is yet another inexhaustible treasure trove of wonderful music that I can't wait to share with you. For now, though, thanks so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you in 2 weeks, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show gain more visibility. Please send any questions to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.